What if you boarded a fancy private jet, expecting a dream flight, only to be judged and humiliated in front of everyone, just because of how you looked? That's exactly what happened to Aisha Carter on a sunny morning at Chicago O'Hare International Airport, and what unfolded next would leave everyone on that plane stunned. The private jet sparkled under the late morning sun, its sleek design promising a journey of pure luxury. Inside, the cabin felt like a five-star hotel. Plush leather seats, shiny chrome details, and a soft jazz tune playing in the background. Passengers settled in, their designer luggage rolling behind them as they sipped mimosas handed out by the flight crew. Some scrolled through their phones, others chatted quietly, all soaking in the VIP vibe. Among them was Aisha Carter, a 38-year-old woman with a quiet kind of grace. She wore a sharp charcoal blazer and matching trousers, her outfit simple but elegant. Aisha moved with confidence, her steps measured, but she didn't try to stand out. She was on her way to a big meeting to oversee her growing business empire, but no one on this plane had any idea who she really was. Aisha liked it that way. She wasn't one to flaunt her power. She just wanted to get to her destination without any fuss. At the entrance of the cabin stood Jessica Harper, the lead flight attendant. Her navy uniform was perfectly pressed, her auburn hair pulled back into a tight bun, and her sharp features gave her an air of control. Jessica greeted passengers one by one, her smile warm and welcoming for some, but noticeably colder for others. She prided herself on keeping things orderly on the plane, but her idea of order often came down to quick judgments about people's appearances. When Aisha stepped aboard, Jessica's warm smile faded fast. "Good morning, ma'am," she said with a stiff nod, her tone flat and unwelcoming. Aisha noticed the change but didn't react, her expression calm as she made her way to her seat. Right behind her, an older couple, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, stepped into the cabin. They were in their late 60s, the kind of seasoned travelers who flew all the time. Mrs. Thompson held a small embroidery kit, her fingers already itching to start stitching, while Mr. Thompson carried a rolled-up magazine, glancing around with mild curiosity. Jessica's attitude flipped like a switch. "Good morning, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson. It's so wonderful to see you again," she said, her voice suddenly sweet as honey. Aisha glanced over her shoulder, catching the stark difference in how Jessica treated them. She didn't say a word, but her eyes showed she understood exactly what was happening. As everyone settled in, Jessica moved through the cabin, making sure everything was perfect. She stopped by the Thompsons, her smile wide and genuine. "Can I get you anything before we take off?" she asked warmly. Mrs. Thompson shook her head, already pulling out her embroidery, while Mr. Thompson pointed to his coffee, perfectly content. But when Jessica passed Aisha, her whole vibe changed. She glanced at Aisha's sleek leather bag tucked neatly under the seat, her lips pressing into a thin line, and kept walking without a single word. No offer of a drink, no smile, nothing. Aisha sat quietly, her gaze drifting to the window where the tarmac shimmered in the sunlight. She was used to being underestimated, but she couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling settling in her chest. Something told her this flight wasn't going to be as smooth as she'd hoped. Little did she know, things were about to take a dramatic turn. The soft hum of the private jet's engines filled the luxurious cabin at Chicago O'Hare International Airport, blending with the faint clink of glassware as the flight crew prepared for takeoff. The passengers were settling into their plush leather seats, the air thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the promise of a smooth, glamorous flight. But for Aisha Carter, sitting quietly near the window, a storm was already brewing, and it had nothing to do with the weather. Aisha, in her sharp charcoal blazer and matching trousers, looked out at the shimmering tarmac, her hands resting calmly in her lap. She wasn't here to make a scene or draw attention. She just wanted to get to her business meeting without any trouble. But she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in her chest since boarding. The way Jessica, the lead flight attendant, had greeted her with such a cold tone stuck with her. Aisha was used to people underestimating her, but this felt different. It felt personal. Jessica Harper moved through the aisle like she owned the place, her navy uniform crisp and her auburn hair pulled back so tightly it looked like it hurt. She had a sharp, commanding presence, her eyes scanning the passengers with a mix of control and judgment. Jessica prided herself on keeping everything in order, but her version of order often meant deciding who belonged and who didn't based on her own biases. And to her, Aisha didn't fit the mold of someone who should be in the elite section of this fancy jet. It wasn't Aisha's tailored outfit or her quiet confidence that bothered Jessica. It was the fact that Aisha didn't seem to care about impressing anyone. She didn't flaunt designer labels or demand attention like some of the other passengers Jessica deemed worthy. In Jessica's mind, Aisha didn't belong here, and that thought gnawed at her as she made her rounds. She stopped in front of Aisha's seat, her lips curling into a tight, forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said, her voice polite but dripping with condescension. "I think you're in the wrong section." Aisha looked up, her dark eyes meeting Jessica's with a steady calm that caught Jessica off guard. "I believe this is my seat," Aisha replied, her tone even and polite, but firm. There was a strength in her voice that made it clear she wasn't going to back down easily. Jessica's smile didn't budge, but her tone sharpened, cutting through the soft jazz playing in the background. "I don't think so," she said, her words clipped. "This section is reserved for our elite passengers." The comment hung in the air like a heavy cloud, and nearby passengers started to notice. A socialite with a designer scarf draped over her shoulder leaned in closer, her eyes glinting with curiosity like she was watching a drama unfold on her favorite reality show. Across the aisle, a kind-looking businessman in a tailored suit frowned slightly, his brow furrowing as he caught the edge in Jessica's voice. He adjusted his glasses, glancing over at Aisha with a hint of concern. Aisha didn't flinch. She kept her gaze locked on Jessica, her expression as calm as ever. "You might want to double-check your passenger list before making assumptions," she said, her voice steady but carrying a quiet power that made a few passengers sit up a little straighter. Jessica's eyebrows shot up, her irritation bubbling to the surface. "I don't need to check anything," she snapped, her voice loud enough to turn more heads. "I know who belongs here and who doesn't." The tension in the cabin thickened, the air growing heavy with unspoken words. Passengers started whispering to each other, their voices low but curious. "Why doesn't she just move if she's in the wrong seat?" one woman muttered to her companion, her tone judgmental. Another passenger shrugged, whispering back, "She's probably trying to sneak in for a free upgrade." The socialite smirked, her curiosity growing, while the businessman's frown deepened, his fingers tapping lightly on the armrest as he watched the exchange. Jessica crossed her arms, standing her ground like a gatekeeper. "If you don't move to the back of the plane," she said, her voice now loud enough for everyone to hear, "I'll have to call security." The threat landed like a punch, and a few passengers gasped softly, their eyes wide. Aisha tilted her head slightly, her calm expression unchanged, but there was a spark in her eyes that hinted at something more. "Call whoever you need to," she said, her voice as steady as ever. "But I'm not moving." The socialite let out a soft gasp, her hand fluttering to her chest, while the businessman leaned forward, his concern growing. Jessica's face flushed with frustration, her control slipping as she turned to the junior flight attendant, Emily, who stood nearby, watching the scene with nervous eyes. "Emily!" Jessica barked, her voice sharp enough to make Emily flinch. "Escort her to the back now." Emily hesitated, her gaze darting between Aisha and Jessica. She was younger than Jessica, her uniform a little less polished, and her hands trembled slightly as she clutched a clipboard. She wanted to speak up, to suggest checking the passenger list like Aisha had said, but Jessica's icy glare froze her in place. Reluctantly, Emily nodded and took a small step forward, her voice barely above a whisper. Ma'am, if you could." Aisha cut her off gently, her voice soft but firm. "You might want to think carefully about what you're doing," she said, her words carrying a weight that made Emily pause and Jessica's jaw tighten. Jessica scoffed, waving off the warning like it was nothing. "I know exactly what I'm doing," she said sharply. "Now get up." The cabin fell into an uneasy silence, the passengers holding their breath as they watched the standoff. Aisha's quiet defiance stood in stark contrast to Jessica's growing aggression, and the unspoken question lingered in the air. How far would this go? The flight hadn't even taken off yet. But it was already clear that something big was about to happen. The luxurious cabin of the private jet at Chicago O'Hare International Airport felt like a pressure cooker. The tension between Aisha Carter and Jessica Harper reaching a boiling point. The soft jazz playing in the background couldn't mask the uneasy silence that had settled over the passengers, their eyes darting between the two women like they were watching a storm about to break. Aisha sat calmly in her seat, her charcoal blazer still sharp despite the drama unfolding, her gaze steady and unyielding. But Jessica's hostility was about to take a turn no one saw coming. Jessica stood in the aisle, her arms crossed tightly over her navy uniform, her sharp features twisted with frustration. She had already demanded Aisha move to the back of the plane, accusing her of not belonging in the elite section. But Aisha's calm refusal had thrown her off balance. "You're not supposed to be here," Jessica said again, her voice sharp and impatient as she gestured toward the rear of the plane. Her tone was louder now, almost daring Aisha to challenge her in front of everyone. Aisha leaned back slightly, her dark eyes locked on Jessica's, her composure unshaken. "You shouldn't make assumptions about people," she said quietly, her words carrying a gentle but firm rebuke that seemed to hit Jessica like a slap. Jessica's smirk widened, her voice dripping with mockery as she leaned in closer. "And you shouldn't be in seats you didn't pay for," she shot back, her tone loud enough to make the passengers nearby shift uncomfortably in their seats. The socialite with the designer scarf, who had been watching the drama unfold like it was her favorite soap opera, leaned toward her companion, whispering loudly, "Looks like she's trying to sneak in for a free ride." Her words were meant to be private, but they carried across the quiet cabin, and Jessica latched on to them like fuel for her fire. "That's exactly what it looks like," Jessica said, folding her arms and turning to the other passengers, as if to rally their support. "We have rules for a reason. Some people just don't respect them." Aisha didn't react to the insults or the growing whispers around her. She kept her gaze steady on Jessica, her calm presence a quiet defiance that seemed to make Jessica even angrier. Emily, the junior flight attendant, stood near the galley, her hands trembling as she clutched her clipboard. She wanted to do the right thing, check the passenger list like Aisha had suggested. But Jessica's sharp glare had her frozen. Still, Emily took a small step toward the list, hoping to diffuse the situation. But Jessica snapped at her before she could say a word. "Emily, what are you doing?" Jessica's voice was like a whip cutting through the air. "I've got this under control. You don't need to get involved." Emily stepped back quickly, her face flushing with embarrassment, her eyes darting to the floor. She bit her lip, torn between speaking up and the fear of losing her job. The kind businessman across the aisle, his tailored suit as crisp as his demeanor, couldn't stay silent any longer. He leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm as he looked at Aisha. "Excuse me, is everything all right?" he asked, his tone warm with concern. Aisha turned to him, her expression softening just a little. "I'm fine, thank you," she replied, her voice steady but grateful for the small act of kindness in the middle of the storm. Jessica wasn't having it. "Sir, I'd appreciate it if you didn't encourage the disturbance," she said sharply, her tone accusing as she turned back to Aisha, pointing a finger at her. "You're causing a scene." The businessman's frown deepened, his voice calm but pointed. "From where I'm sitting, you're the one making a scene," he said, his words drawing a few nods from other passengers who were starting to see the unfairness of it all. Jessica's face turned red, her frustration boiling over like a pot left on the stove too long. "I've had enough of this," she snapped, stepping closer to Aisha, her voice shaking with anger. "Either you move, or I'll make sure you're escorted off this plane." Aisha met her gaze without a flicker of fear. "You can try," she said softly, her voice steady, her calm presence only making Jessica more furious. A few minutes later, Jessica returned to the aisle, carrying a tray of sparkling water as she went about her other duties. Her movements were brisk, her expression tight, but her anger toward Aisha hadn't cooled. Aisha, still seated, had been waiting patiently for a drink, watching as Jessica served Mr. and Mrs. Thompson first, then moved to the other passengers, deliberately skipping her. The tray was nearly empty when Aisha finally spoke up, her voice gentle but clear. "Excuse me, could I have some water, please?" Jessica paused, barely glancing at Aisha, her eyes cold. "I'll get to you when I can," she said curtly, walking past without another word. Aisha's gaze followed her calm unshaken, but the sting of being ignored was clear in her eyes. Moments later, as Aisha shifted in her seat to stretch her legs slightly into the aisle, Jessica came back, her sharp eyes catching the small movement. Instead of asking Aisha to move, Jessica deliberately changed her path, her foot striking Aisha's leg. The tray tilted and the remaining glasses of water spilled, splashing onto Aisha's lap and the floor with a loud clatter. Jessica gasped dramatically, her voice loud and accusing. "Watch where you're putting your legs. You've caused a mess." Passengers turned their heads, startled by the commotion, their eyes wide with shock. Aisha looked up, startled but still composed, her hands brushing at the water soaking into her trousers. "But you walked into my leg," she said calmly, her voice steady despite the chaos. Jessica stepped closer, her anger reaching a breaking point. "I've only asked to be treated with the same respect as everyone else," Aisha said, her tone unwavering, her eyes locked on Jessica's. "And if that's too much to ask, then maybe you're the one who doesn't belong here." The words hit Jessica like a punch, a quiet but powerful challenge that left her reeling. Her face flushed with rage, her hands trembling as she leaned in closer, her voice a harsh whisper. "You think you can talk to me like that?" And then in a moment that shocked everyone, Jessica raised her hand and slapped Aisha across the face. The sound echoed through the cabin like a thunderclap, sharp and jarring, freezing everyone in their seats. Gasps rippled through the passengers, the businessman standing halfway up, his face a mix of disbelief and anger. Emily's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror, while the socialite's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of unease. Aisha slowly straightened, her hand resting calmly on her lap, her expression unchanged despite the red mark blooming on her cheek. Her gaze locked onto Jessica, steady and unyielding, the weight of her stare making Jessica hesitate for the first time. The cabin fell silent, the tension so thick you could feel it in the air. "You just made the worst mistake of your life," Aisha said quietly, her voice calm but sharp, cutting through the silence like a blade. Emily, standing near the galley, couldn't take it anymore. Her hands shook as she slipped away, pulling out her phone with trembling fingers. She dialed a number quickly, her voice hushed but urgent. "It's Emily," she whispered when the call connected. "We have a situation on the plane." The passengers held their breath, their eyes glued to Aisha and Jessica, wondering what would happen next. The flight hadn't even taken off, but it was already spurling into something unforgettable. The cabin of the private jet at Chicago O'Hare International Airport felt like it was holding its breath, the echo of Jessica Harper's slap still hanging in the air like a dark cloud. Aisha Carter sat in her seat, her charcoal blazer now damp from the spilled water, a faint red mark on her cheek from the slap. But her calm demeanor hadn't wavered. Her words, "You just made the worst mistake of your life," rang in everyone's ears, and for the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed Jessica's sharp features. The passengers, still reeling from the shocking moment, exchanged uneasy glances, their whispers growing louder as the tension thickened. Jessica stood in the aisle, her navy uniform no longer a symbol of authority, but a stark contrast to the panic creeping into her eyes. Her arms were crossed tightly, her face flushed with a mix of anger and uncertainty. She tried to regain her footing, her voice trembling as she forced a scoff. "Regret it?" she sneered, leaning closer to Aisha, her tone mocking. "What are you going to do? Call the police?" Aisha didn't respond right away. Instead, she leaned back slightly, her gaze steady and unreadable, her silence more powerful than any comeback could be. The passengers felt the shift in the air, though they didn't yet understand why. From the corner of the cabin, Emily, the junior flight attendant, returned to her spot near the galley, her face pale after making her discreet phone call to management. She clutched her clipboard tightly, her hands still trembling, but a small spark of hope flickered in her chest. She had reported the situation, hoping someone higher up would step in to fix this mess. The kind businessman across the aisle, his tailored suit as neat as his calm demeanor, tapped his fingers on the armrest, his eyes fixed on Aisha with a knowing look, as if he sensed something the others didn't. The socialite with the designer scarf whispered to her companion, her voice tinged with curiosity. "Do you think she's someone important?" She doesn't seem fazed at all. Aisha's composure was like a rock in a stormy sea, unshaken by Jessica's aggression. She reached for her phone on the armrest, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she knew exactly what she was doing. She typed something quickly, her fingers steady, then set the phone back down, her expression serene but with a hint of something more. A quiet power that made Jessica glance at the device uneasily. "What do you think you're doing?" Jessica asked, her voice sharp, though there was a tremor of nervousness in it now. Aisha didn't answer immediately, her calm demeanor making the silence feel heavier. "You'll find out soon enough," she said softly, her words carrying a weight that sent a chill down Jessica's spine. The cabin fell into an uneasy silence, broken only by the faint hum of the plane's engines and the occasional whisper among the passengers. The socialite leaned closer to her companion, her voice barely above a whisper. "What's going on? This is getting intense," she said, her eyes wide with intrigue. Mr. Thompson, who had been quietly reading his magazine, looked up for the first time, his curiosity piqued, while Mrs. Thompson paused her embroidery, her hands still as she watched the scene unfold. The businessman across the aisle sat quietly, a small smile tugging at his lips, as if he had already pieced together something no one else had. Minutes later, the sound of footsteps came from the front of the cabin, sharp and purposeful. The cockpit door swung open, and Captain Daniels stepped out, his face pale and his expression tight with tension. He scanned the room quickly, his eyes landing on Jessica, and he walked straight toward her, his movements brisk. Jessica turned to him, her irritation flaring up again. "What's going on?" she asked, her tone sharp as she crossed her arms tighter. "I'm handling this." Captain Daniels stopped in front of her, his posture stiff, his voice firm but laced with unease. "You need to step aside," he said, his words cutting through the murmurs in the cabin. Jessica's frown deepened, her confusion clear. "Excuse me?" she said, her voice rising with defiance. "Why would I need to step aside? I've got this under control." The pilot's gaze flicked to Aisha for a brief moment, then back to Jessica, his expression serious. "I just received a call from management," he said plainly, his voice steady. "The owner of this plane is on board, and she's Ms. Carter here." He pointed directly at Aisha, his words hitting the room like a lightning bolt. Gas erupted from the passengers, the sound rippling through the cabin like a wave. The socialite audibly inhaled, her eyes widening as she looked between Aisha and Jessica, her hand clutching her scarf. "She owns the plane?" she whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. The businessman nodded slowly, his small smile growing. "I had a feeling," he muttered under his breath, as if the revelation confirmed a hunch he'd had all along. Emily, standing near the galley, froze in place, her clipboard slipping slightly in her hands as relief washed over her. Aisha wasn't just another passenger. She was someone far more powerful than anyone had realized. Jessica stared at the pilot, her face turning a ghostly shade of white, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to find words. That can't be true," she stammered, her voice losing its usual sharpness, her hands dropping to her sides. "There must be some mistake." Her eyes darted to Aisha, who remained seated, her posture as poised as ever, her expression calm but commanding, like she had been waiting for this moment all along. Before Jessica could say another word, the captain's voice came over the intercom, his tone steady but urgent. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be making an unscheduled landing. Please remain seated and prepare for descent." The passengers murmured in confusion, their whispers growing louder. The businessman leaned toward Aisha, his voice low and curious. "What's happening? Why are we landing?" Aisha didn't answer, her expression serene, but the faintest hint of a smile played at the corners of her lips, a quiet confidence that sent a shiver through Jessica. The plane touched down smoothly, the wheels hitting the tarmac with a soft thud. Moments later, a sleek black SUV pulled up right beside the plane, its doors opening quickly. Two sharply dressed assistants stepped out, their movements brisk and professional, and they climbed the plane's steps with an air of quiet authority that made everyone sit up straighter. The moment they entered the cabin, one of them spoke, her voice warm and respectful. "Ms. Carter," she said, nodding to Aisha with a smile, "everything is ready for your review." More gasps filled the cabin, the passengers' eyes widening as the reality sank in. Jessica froze, her face now completely drained of color, her hands trembling at her sides. "Miss Carter?" she whispered, her voice barely audible, her earlier confidence shattered. The assistants ignored her, their focus entirely on Aisha. "Do you need anything before we proceed?" one of them asked, their tone respectful and attentive. Aisha stood slowly, her movements graceful and deliberate, like a queen rising from her throne. She adjusted her blazer, smoothing out the damp spot from the spilled water, her calm demeanor radiating a quiet power that filled the entire cabin. The passengers watched in stunned silence, their eyes glued to her as she spoke, her voice steady and commanding, cutting through the tension like a knife. "I'm Aisha Carter," she began, her gaze sweeping across the room, taking in every face. "I'm the owner of this plane, and I'm also the owner of this airline." The cabin erupted into a mix of gasps and murmurs, the passengers' jaws dropping as the truth hit them. Jessica's legs seemed to wobble beneath her, her earlier bravado replaced by sheer panic, her eyes wide with fear. Aisha turned her attention to Jessica, her voice calm but sharp, each word landing like a hammer. "Jessica, your behavior today has been nothing short of disgraceful," she said, her tone cutting through the silence. "You've humiliated yourself, mistreated a passenger, and tarnished the reputation of this airline." Jessica stammered, her voice shaking as she tried to speak. I, I didn't know," she managed to say, her hands trembling uncontrollably. Aisha held up a hand, silencing her instantly, her gaze unyielding. "You didn't know because you didn't bother to treat me with the respect every passenger deserves," she said firmly, her words echoing with authority. "Instead, you made assumptions, acted with prejudice, and escalated a situation that could have been handled with basic decency." The passengers nodded quietly, their earlier silence giving way to murmurs of agreement. The businessman's face lit up with admiration, his eyes shining with respect, while Mr. Thompson folded his magazine neatly, giving Aisha a small approving nod. Even Mrs. Thompson set her embroidery down, her hands resting in her lap as she watched Aisha with a newfound respect. Aisha's revelation had flipped everything upside down, and Jessica was about to face the consequences of her actions. What do you think about Jessica's behavior? Have you ever witnessed something like this? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, hit that like button if you're loving this story, and don't forget to subscribe for more jaw-dropping moments like this. The truth is out, but the story isn't over yet. Things are about to get even more intense. The private jet sat on the tarmac at Chicago O'Hare International Airport, its engines quiet after the unscheduled landing, but the air inside the cabin was electric with tension. Aisha Carter stood tall in the aisle, her charcoal blazer slightly wrinkled from the spilled water, her presence commanding every inch of the luxurious space. Her revelation, that she was the owner of the plane and the airline, had left everyone speechless, their eyes wide with shock and admiration. But for Jessica Harper, the lead flight attendant, the truth hit like a tidal wave, washing away her confidence and leaving her trembling in its wake. Jessica stood frozen, her Navy uniform no longer a symbol of control, but a stark reminder of how far she'd fallen. Her face was pale, her hands shaking as she stammered, "Please, Miss Carter, I didn't mean—" Her voice cracked, her earlier arrogance replaced by a desperate plea. But Aisha cut her off with a raised hand, her gaze steady and unyielding. "You didn't mean to get caught," Aisha said coldly, her voice sharp and clear, slicing through the cabin like a blade. "But you did, and now you'll face the consequences." Aisha took a step closer to Jessica, her tone measured but firm, each word carrying the weight of her authority. "While you were busy judging me, you failed to do your job," she said, her voice echoing with quiet power. "Your job is to treat every passenger with respect, no matter who they are or what you assume about them. But instead, you let your prejudice take over, and you crossed a line that can't be undone." Jessica's eyes darted around the cabin, searching for someone, anyone, to back her up. But the passengers' faces were a mix of disapproval and support for Aisha. Some even had their phones out, quietly recording the moment, their expressions a mix of shock and awe. Turning to Captain Daniels, who stood nearby, Aisha's voice remained steady, her authority undeniable. "I want this addressed immediately," she said, her gaze flicking to Jessica for a moment before returning to the pilot. And I want to make sure this never happens again. To anyone. Captain Daniels nodded, his demeanor professional, but his eyes reflecting the gravity of the situation. Understood, Ms. Carter, he said, his tone resolute, his hands clasped behind his back as he awaited further instructions. Jessica took a shaky step back, her mind racing with panic. Her eyes darted toward the exit, her instincts screaming at her to run, to escape the consequences of her actions. But before she could make a move, Captain Daniels stepped into her path, his expression firm and unwavering. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his voice low but commanding, blocking her escape with his presence. Aisha's gaze returned to Jessica, her voice steady and unyielding, her words a final verdict. "Jessica, your actions today have proven that you are unfit for this position," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Effective immediately, you are fired." The words landed like a gavel in a courtroom, heavy and final, and Jessica's face crumpled, her shoulders slumping as tears welled up in her eyes. "Please, Miss Carter," she whispered, her voice breaking as she clasped her hands together, begging. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean—" Aisha's expression hardened, her eyes narrowing slightly, the red mark on her cheek from Jessica's slap still faintly visible. "Your apology means nothing without accountability," she said quietly, her voice firm but not cruel. "You made your choices, and now you'll face the consequences." The passengers watched in stunned silence, their earlier whispers replaced by a heavy quiet, the weight of Aisha's words sinking in. Just then, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed from the entrance of the plane, steady and purposeful. Two uniformed police officers boarded, their presence sending a ripple of murmurs through the cabin. Their badges gleamed under the cabin lights, and their faces were serious as they approached Aisha, their movements respectful. "Ms. Carter," one of the officers said, his tone professional as he nodded to her. "We received your report. Are you pressing charges?" Aisha's gaze didn't waver, her voice steady and resolute. "Yes," she said firmly, her words ringing with conviction. "This individual assaulted me in front of multiple witnesses. I expect her to be held accountable." Jessica's face turned ashen, her breath catching in her throat as the reality of her situation hit her. "Wait, this is a misunderstanding," she cried, her voice desperate, her hands reaching out as if she could stop what was happening. "I didn't mean to." The officer stepped forward, pulling a pair of handcuffs from his belt, his voice calm but firm. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for assault," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Jessica's breathing quickened, her eyes darting to Aisha, who stood calm and composed, her presence a stark contrast to Jessica's unraveling state. The second officer gently but firmly took Jessica's arms, cuffing her hands behind her back as tears streamed down her face. "Please, Ms. Carter, I'm sorry," Jessica sobbed, her voice breaking as she was led down the aisle, her polished shoes dragging slightly on the carpet. Her once dominant demeanor was gone, replaced by regret and humiliation, her sobs echoing through the cabin as the officers escorted her out. The passengers watched in silence, their eyes following her until she disappeared down the steps to the tarmac, her career and her pride left in tatters. Aisha turned back to the cabin, her expression softening as she addressed the passengers, her voice warm but steady. "To everyone here, I apologize for what you had to witness today," she said, her tone sincere, her eyes meeting theirs with genuine care. "This is not the standard of service I expect on my planes. Moving forward, we will ensure that every passenger is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve." The cabin erupted into applause, the passengers clapping enthusiastically, their admiration for Aisha clear in their faces. Mr. Thompson gave a small cheer, his magazine forgotten on his lap, while Mrs. Thompson set her embroidery aside, clapping politely, a rare smile on her face. Aisha's gaze shifted to Emily, the junior flight attendant who had quietly supported her throughout the ordeal. Emily stood near the galley, her clipboard still clutched tightly, her eyes wide with a mix of relief and gratitude. "Emily," Aisha said, her tone softening even more, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I noticed your professionalism today. You stayed calm and did the right thing, even when it was hard. Thank you for stepping up when it mattered. You'll be hearing from my office about a promotion." Emily's eyes widened, a bright smile breaking across her face as she nodded quickly, her voice trembling with emotion. "Thank you, Miss Carter," she said softly, her hands shaking slightly as she brushed a strand of hair behind her ear, overwhelmed by the recognition. The passengers smiled at the exchange, the warmth of the moment spreading through the cabin like a ray of sunshine after a storm. Aisha gave a brief nod, her smile lingering for a moment before she turned toward the exit, her two assistants following closely behind. As she descended the steps to the tarmac, the black SUV waited patiently, its driver holding the door open for her. The passengers watched her go, their admiration for her palpable, their murmurs of respect filling the cabin. The atmosphere had shifted completely, the earlier tension replaced by a sense of relief and justice. Aisha had taken a stand, and no one on that flight would ever forget it. The tarmac at Chicago O'Hare International Airport shimmered under the late morning sun as Aisha Carter stepped out of the private jet, her charcoal blazer catching the light as she descended the steps. The black SUV waited for her, its driver holding the door open, and her two assistants walked beside her, already briefing her on her next meeting. But as Aisha took a deep breath of the fresh air, her thoughts lingered on the events that had just unfolded. She had turned a moment of injustice into something powerful, and the impact of her actions was only just beginning to ripple outward. Back inside the cabin, the passengers were still buzzing with awe, their voices a mix of admiration and disbelief as they replayed the dramatic scene in their minds. The socialite with the designer scarf, who had watched the entire ordeal with wide-eyed fascination, leaned forward in her seat, her voice filled with wonder. "Ms. Carter, you're incredible," she blurted out, her admiration shining through her usually polished demeanor. Aisha, just about to step into the SUV, turned back for a moment, a gentle smile gracing her lips. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice warm but firm. "Remember this moment. It's always worth standing up for what's right." The story of what happened on that flight spread like wildfire, leaping from the tarmac to social media in a matter of hours. Aisha's calm strength, her revelation as the owner of the airline, and the way she handled Jessica's prejudice went viral, capturing the hearts of millions. Hashtags like washing respect for all and Aisha's legacy trended for days, with people sharing their own stories of standing up against unfair treatment, inspired by Aisha's courage. The video of her confrontation, captured by a passenger, racked up millions of views and comments poured in, praising her for showing the world what true leadership looked like. A few weeks later, Aisha sat in a sleek television studio in downtown Chicago, the bright lights highlighting the emerald green dress she'd chosen for the interview, a bold contrast to the charcoal blazer she'd worn on the flight. The interviewer, a woman with a warm smile and a notebook full of questions, leaned forward, her eyes sparkling with admiration. "Ms. Carter, your story has touched millions of people," she said, her voice earnest. "It's gone viral, and everyone's talking about how you handled that situation on the plane. What message do you want to share with the world?" Aisha's gaze was steady, her voice clear and resonant as she spoke, her words carrying the weight of her experience. "Respect is a right, not a privilege," she said, her tone firm but filled with heart. "Everyone deserves dignity, no matter how they look, where they come from, or what others assume about them. True leadership isn't about power. It's about setting a standard of kindness and ensuring it's upheld no matter what." The audience in the studio burst into applause, their claps echoing through the room. But Aisha wasn't done. The interviewer nodded, visibly moved, her hands clasped together as she asked her next question. "And what would you say to those who face similar challenges but don't have the platform you do?" Aisha's expression softened, a quiet strength shining in her eyes as she leaned forward slightly, her voice warm and encouraging. "I'd say that strength comes from within," she replied, her words like a hug to anyone listening. "Even when you feel invisible, remember your worth. You don't need a title or wealth to demand respect. You just need to stand firm in who you are. Your voice matters and you're stronger than you think." The studio audience erupted into another round of applause, some even wiping tears from their eyes as Aisha's words sank in. Her message wasn't just for the people in that room, it was for everyone watching at home, for anyone who had ever felt judged or overlooked. Aisha's story had become a beacon of hope, a reminder that standing up for what's right could spark change far beyond a single moment. A month later, Aisha boarded another flight, this time heading from Chicago to New York for a big business summit. The energy on board was completely different from her last experience, warm, welcoming, and filled with respect. The lead flight attendant, a young man with a genuine smile, greeted her with a nod of admiration. "Welcome aboard, Miss Carter," he said, his voice sincere. "It's an honor to have you with us." Aisha returned the smile, settling into her seat near the front of the plane, the window beside her framing a breathtaking view of the horizon. As the jet took off, climbing higher into the sky, Aisha gazed out at the endless stretch of clouds, the world below fading into a sea of blue and white. The atmosphere on the plane felt lighter, the service impeccable, and the respect she received from the crew was genuine, not forced. She thought back to that fateful flight, the cold stares, the slap, the humiliation, and how she'd turned it into a moment of triumph, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly. Aisha's actions had sparked real change. In a public statement released shortly after the incident, she spoke directly to the world, her words carrying a message that resonated far and wide. "Luxury isn't about appearances," she said in a heartfelt video that quickly gained millions of views. "It's about the experience we create for everyone. True success isn't measured by what you can afford. It's measured by how you treat others. That's why I'm implementing new policies across my airline to ensure that every passenger, no matter who they are, feels valued and respected." Her statement ignited conversations across the globe, with people applauding her leadership and her commitment to change. The new policies she introduced became a model for other airlines, inspiring a wave of reforms that prioritize respect and equality. Aisha's vision had turned a single moment of injustice into a movement, encouraging everyone to reflect on their own behavior and biases. As the jet soared higher, the engines humming softly, Aisha leaned back in her seat, a quiet sense of triumph settling over her. The horizon stretched endlessly before her, a canvas of possibility that mirrored the clarity she felt inside. This wasn't just about confronting prejudice or asserting her authority. It was about building a future where respect and kindness were the standard, not the exception. Aisha smiled to herself, her reflection faintly visible in the window, knowing that her actions had inspired change far beyond that one flight. So what's the biggest lesson we can take from Aisha's story? It's simple but powerful. Respect isn't optional. It's a must, no matter who someone appears to be. True strength comes from standing up for what's right, even when it's hard, and treating others with kindness can create a ripple effect that changes the world. Have you ever faced a situation like this, or seen someone stand up for what's right? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Hit that like button if this story inspired you, and don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories that'll keep you coming back for more. Let's keep spreading kindness, one story at a time.